am recording now that you said that. Yes. Cool. All right. So it is episode number 4 of the Conscious Bodybuilding Podcast. Today we have my co-host on, Matt Bellino, and we also have Dr. Damon McCune on. Dr. Damon McCune he has a PhD, RDN and LD. What is an LD? I'm sorry.
It's redundant. So in Nevada, we have licensure as dietitian. So I'm a registered dietitian, but in Nevada, part of the law is that I have to list that I'm also licensed. So it's just licensed dietitian. It's redundant.
Cool. Yeah. But that means you can work with the dietitian aspect of it allows you to work with people with other conditions such as diabetes and things like that, right? Because otherwise you can't.
The way that it's referred to is I'm able to practice medical nutrition therapy.
Oh, cool. And then Damon is also the co-founder of Allied Performance Nutrition. Is that the correct term?
Yep. Well, it's just Allied Performance. It's my fiance and I's private practice.
Cool. And you guys do nutrition consultation, things like that.
Yep.
And then he's
we
also
do consulting for medical practices.
Oh, cool. And then he's also the co-founder of the Vertical Diet, which is actually how I originally met Damon. Quick little tangent. So this is actually kind of relates to why I'm even doing the podcast. But the way I met Damon was at a Vertical Diet seminar in Vegas a couple of years back. And it was like a very profound experience for me just because it was like a group of 2 or 3 other competitors at the time. And I had just done a contest prep that I actually wasn't able to finish because I actually got sick. And it was because of the old school practices. I was doing literally in the gym for 4 hours a day. I had no fat in my diet. I actually was having trouble actually standing up, and I was having anxiety attacks, things like that. I just never had experienced before. And I was standing in the circle of all these people who had experienced similar things. And a lot of them had already tried the diet, and they were like, I didn't have any of that. I felt so much better. My health was improved. And it was just really it was a turning point for myself, because I realized a lot of the stuff that's being practiced, that's still being practiced is kind of outdated. And it made me really start to actually look into the research. I started with the Vertical Diet, looking through the evidence on there, and then just went off from there. I got to learn this and this and this. So I wanted to thank you for that. And, just that's kind of why I'm even doing this podcast in the first place, is that was the turning point for myself, where I stopped doing all the bro science stuff and started getting into the actual science of things. So,
well, I'm glad it's worked so well for you, man. That means a lot. So,
yeah. So, and I think Matt does some of the Vertical Diet as well to an extent.
Components of it, yeah.
So to get into today's questions, I think, Matt, you had a question that you wanted to ask Damon.
Yeah, so we'll start it off. The first question I wanted to ask was what you researched when you were doing your PhD.
Sure. So this is going to be a little bit longer answer than you bargained for.
Right.
All good.
A lot of people are not necessarily familiar with the process. So when you go through a PhD, you actually do a lot of research. And so I was involved in a lot of stuff that wasn't necessarily just my dissertation. So my master's research was on 25-hydroxyvitamin D, IGF-1, and metabolic syndrome. And then my dissertation research was on carbohydrate manipulation in resistance training, and I looked specifically at squats. My overall research is really just based on optimizing human performance through physical activity and nutrition. So a whole spectrum there. I mean, that's a really broad thing, but really if it involves, any kind of health or, performance, aspect, and that can be, it doesn't just mean athletic performance. That means performance just in terms of your body's performance on a daily basis and your activities of daily living. Ways to really make that as the best that it can be and optimize it. So my dissertation work, I looked at carbohydrate manipulation on squats. And as of right now, I believe I'm still the only person in the world who's looked at mouth rinsing on squat performance, which was a pretty interesting experience. For those that aren't familiar with that, a mouth rinse is just what it sounds like. You just rinse some stuff around in your mouth for 5 seconds and spit it out. You don't swallow anything. That's some really, really interesting findings on blood glucose. Almost half of my participants had a significant spike in their blood glucose following the squat protocol. They did 5 sets of squats. We standardized the weight that they used. They only used 135 pounds. So the first 3 sets, they did 10 reps, and that was standard. Then the 4th and 5th set, they went to failure. And it was basically until they couldn't feel comfortable doing another full rep. So, that varied tremendously, but that changed their training volume. So that's what I was looking at, was could we impact training volume by doing these different manipulations with the carbohydrate? And almost half of my participants had, just very, very unexpected spikes in their blood glucose. So that's a new thing. We really haven't.
Yeah. Is that a mouth rinse with a carbohydrate mixture?
Yeah. And it was essentially about the concentration of Gatorade. So I did 2-to-1 glucose to fructose. And I just used dextrose and fructose powder to do it. And so they did 25 milliliters right before the 4th set, and then again right before the 5th set. So I had them treat it like an ammonia cap, and then 3 minutes rest, and they did their last set. So what's really interesting is that, if you're under a lot of very, acute stress like that, your body will increase the release of glucose into the bloodstream at a higher rate than your muscles can actually take in. So that's why if you're like a type 1 diabetic or you're insulin dependent, there's some training protocols that may be problematic because, the body's going to start to release that stuff in there. So this was actually one of those where if I'm working with somebody that is insulin dependent, I'm going to pay attention to what they're doing in their training. And this is probably not something I would necessarily recommend for them based on my results.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it was so substantial in terms of the spike.
Right. So if they're doing maybe a higher intensity routine, they might get more glucose in their blood, and then the insulin, they may not, the amount of insulin they have to take would vary, right, greatly.
Right. And they're going to have a hard time dosing it. And even if they're wearing an insulin pump, like even, that would be a little bit better, but those are still delayed a little bit.
Yeah.
So it still could be problematic for them. I didn't use anybody that was insulin dependent, and I didn't have anybody that had diabetes. So
right.
These were normal people. So within about 3 minutes post training, everybody was pretty much back to baseline. But if you have somebody that doesn't have the ability to have that mechanism to bring it back down, that could be.
It will stay elevated. Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting, actually.
Yeah. I didn't see a real big difference in training volume though. And I did 3 different studies. The first 2, they actually drank carbohydrate, and I did concentrations. And I really didn't see a difference in training volume. So it really,
as far as volume they could tolerate, or like
volume of actual squats. So
okay. Like it changed the repetition.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we, because the concept, we always talk about how, carbs can fuel workload, and it probably can, because my training protocol was only 5 sets. So, the entire training protocol only lasted about 25 minutes. If it was a longer training protocol and we did more stuff, it may have an impact. And that's kind of what the literature shows. With mine being such a short time period, we didn't have that outcome.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that carbohydrates don't help training, but what it did show, everybody came in fasted. What it did show was that and they only came in about twice a week. So if there's maybe 2 mornings, because we get people all the time, they're like, listen, I have to train early and I can't eat before I go train. Is that okay? It's not ideal probably, but what this showed was that, if the training is around that time frame, then they can probably still get just as much out of it. Like, it's still worth going rather than skipping the training if they're not going to eat before.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So do the mouth rinses, do they work just before you, it's kind of like you're saying like the ammonia. Would that work with any compound? Let's say you're doing deadlifts or something like that. It causes some sort of insulin spike?
Well, so I didn't do it because of the glucose. Like, that was not at all what we were expecting. I did it because there's a neurotropic stimulation. So you've got, it'll start to release, it'll basically stimulate CNS. And so it's kind of like the potentiation.
Waking you up a little.
Right. And so they've been able to show this in aerobic training and in cyclists and things like that, and sprints. So that was where I was coming from, was like, okay, if we can do this and it will give some excitability, will that, provide any aspect to this? Because when they use carbohydrate aerobically, everybody reports a lower perceived exertion. So whatever they're doing feels easier.
Right.
Even if they're at the same weight. And
Right.
I didn't really keep track of that for my study because it's such a soft data point anyway.
Yeah.
And I wasn't necessarily concerned about that because I just wanted to see if they were going to do another rep. I don't care if you feel like hell you're doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
It's tough because there's like not objectivity there per se, it's
right. It's a Likert scale. So it's
I
like
heard,
1 to 10, how bad did that feel?
I heard Scott Stevens say once he was in a clinical setting and he had this guy and he was just like trying to run him into the ground to get him at like a perceived like pain of 10. Yep. And he said this guy kept rating it really low and I was like destroying him, like throwing everything at him. And then he comes to find out after he does the study, he's like talking to the guy and he's like, yeah, when I was like, I don't know, a couple of years back, I was riding BMX and I rode my bike over a fence and landed and impaled my stomach onto the fence and was dangling over the fence for like 2 hours until someone helped me. And he was like, oh, that's why your perceived pain is like not your 10 is that. So this
right.
What we're doing in the gym is like a 6. Yeah. Whatever.
Yeah.
So it's based on personal experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why he thinks that's a 10.
Yeah.
We'll get into the next question. So I'm actually glad you mentioned that. So we're talking, I hear a lot of things back and forth with spiking your insulin post-workout.
Mm-hmm.
One question I had was when you consume your protein, let's say it's a simple way, it's absorbed. What's the time frame that it's in the bloodstream? Where should you wait for the protein to kind of give it some time before you spike your insulin with dextrose? Or
so it's going to depend on your training, right? And so basically, if we're talking about the anabolic window post-training, how long that is and how sensitive your body is going to depend on how intense your training was and how long you were doing it. So everyone's going to be a little bit different, but let's just assume that you were in the gym for a solid 45 minutes and it was pretty intense. I mean, you had a pretty solid hypertrophy training workout. You did 10 to 20 working sets of a pretty major body part. We'll just say legs. Mm-hmm. So your anabolic window can last up to 4 hours. And within that 4 hours, about the first 2 hours, your cells are going to take up nutrients independent of insulin. So you don't even need the insulin there. It's going to continue to take in stuff at a higher rate than usual.
Right.
For that last 2 hours, you're probably going to be more sensitive to the insulin that then gets released. So the way that we approach this is, protein is important. Don't get me wrong. And post-training protein has gotten a lot of attention and deservedly so. But if people are getting enough protein throughout the day, that time frame is probably more important to be focusing on the things that you've lost during that training, which is carbohydrate and electrolytes. And you can make the argument that if you were to take in protein, let's say right after the workout, you either have a meal or you have a shake with carbs and electrolytes and protein. The protein is going to slow down digestion. So it could slow down the amount of time and potentially maybe reduce the amount of carbohydrate that you take in. Mm-hmm. Now, this is all probably really marginal. So the bottom line there is that what's the meaningful result? Well, it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. If people really like to get their protein after training, fine, But again, if they're eating really consistently throughout the day and they're getting all their protein throughout the day, it's probably not that critical. But they did lose a lot of glycogen. And They definitely lost a lot of sodium, calcium, all of those things through sweating and actual muscle contraction. So that's why we focus on what we focus on. The first thing that we want to do is replenish those things. That's the most immediate. Body also doesn't like to use amino acids for energy. So even when you were training, unless you were fasted and you had fasted for quite a while, that's that's the exception there, because then your body will start to use, non-carbohydrate sources, and that's usually protein and muscle. But it doesn't like to use amino acids for energy. So it's using stored carbohydrate, glycogen from muscle and your liver. And you're losing a lot more sodium than you probably realize. So getting those things back in is what we really focus on first.
Do you think it's, by any chance, do you think it's critical that there is some sort of dextrose or insulin spike post-workout? Because I've seen studies where it shows that enough protein actually causes some sort of an insulin reaction. What are your thoughts?
And that's correct, because protein is glucogenic. So and that's why a lot of people who are claiming to be on a ketogenic diet, it's questionable, because they're taking in so much protein, because that can get converted to carbohydrate.
Right.
And so that's kind of what's going on there. You know, anytime you have a quote unquote meal or you're fed, you're gonna have an insulin response. You know, the magnitude is going to vary based on the composition of the foods and a lot of other things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, critical to have an insulin spike post training. You know, I would say it's not necessarily a critical thing, because your cells are still taking in the nutrients.
Yeah.
You know, the more we're promoting the carbohydrate, not for the insulin spike, but for the replenishment.
Replenishing of glycogen. Yeah.
Yeah, for in that most immediate time frame after, you don't even need the insulin to have that happen. And same thing while you're training. That's why, you know, you've got the endurance athletes, when they're taking in carbohydrate, their cells are able to utilize that without the insulin, because when you're training, it's suppressing insulin, so it's not
right.
You know.
So what is it that allows that? Is it GLUT4 is one of those things that transports without insulin, right?
So GLUT4 is your glucose transporter, one of them. GLUT5 is more associated with fructose. So that's why we start mixing the carbohydrates, is because it allows the cell more opportunity to pull in the carbohydrates. And then when you start pairing it with things like sodium, it helps to activate the sodium potassium pump, and that can help pull in more carbohydrate, and that helps pull in more fluid. So carbohydrate, when it enters the cell, it brings 3 molecules of water too. So carbohydrate and fluid are all related. Same thing with sodium, you know. So all of those things in the exchange is all related. So the point is to get as much carbohydrate in there as possible. And if we're giving more opportunities for more receptors to engage and pull it in, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I worked with Mountain Dog training for 2 or 3 years. Yeah. Prior to doing the vertical diet. And then I worked with Stan, and I took the intra shake and basically did the glucose, fructose. I was doing dextrose and orange juice intra workout, but I was still doing the amino acids. So you're saying maybe the amino acids aren't, because John uses amino acids. You're saying the amino acids may not be essential during the training window, or during that, like.
There's not a lot to support it. Beyond. Yeah. If you're getting enough protein anyway, there's not really an advantage to the amino acids during training. It doesn't really seem to, you know, when you look at the full body of literature, if you're going to see a benefit, it's probably more so from the carbohydrate, because that will also be protein sparing. So
right.
That kind of, you know, if you like taking them, great. Are they going to hurt you? Absolutely not. Probably, you know, I mean, unless you got some crazy renal thing going on, but, you know, it's not going to bother anybody usually. So, you know, you can take it. Is there an advantage? I'd say probably not.
Yeah. I think he acknowledges that too, that there's not a lot of literature on it. So I think he's aware of that. I don't know. He just says anecdotally that's how it feels. But one other thing that I wanted to, so when you're using a large amount of carbohydrates in this window, bodybuilders who take exogenous insulin around this window, is that like maybe not necessary if it's like 200, 300, 400 grams of carbohydrates? Because I've heard of people like, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is not medical advice, right?
Yes, sorry, I would clarify that.
The use of exogenous, you know, substances or whatever, but hypothetically in that scenario, you know, I would say that is probably not the time to take it. I would actually wait, because you've already got the sensitivity, and you're really, it's almost a waste of the insulin, you know, if you're injecting it, because you've already got the sensitivity of the cells. I would wait until that 4-hour plus window and do it then.
Okay.
Now your body has lost the sensitivity. So if you're using your insulin at that point, now you've created another window where you've developed a sensitive time frame, rather than, you know, that 1 2 to 4 hour whatever window. You know, you put all your eggs in that one basket, and that extra insulin didn't really do anything because your cells were already hypersensitive. So
got it. Asking for a friend, just
right.
Cool. Well, that's great. kind of use a lot of that information to kind of build my workout nutrition. Like, so usually I'll do the carb shake. What I was doing was I also would have the meal after. I would do bison, rice, and honey. I would still do that mixture, but then that would be protein. So it would probably be like an hour or two later. But I would do the thermotabs and the dextrose and the fructose all during my training. So how would you say that as far as like a post-workout? Or I would do like a low fat, like a chicken with pineapple and rice and whatever.
Yeah, well, you know how we feel about chicken. But
yeah, I know that.
And it's not bad, but yeah, no, that sounds great. The only thing I would caution for people who may be new to this is, you know, you can't just take a whole bunch of sodium all at once, because you're going to give yourself osmotic diarrhea, and that's just an awful experience. So, you know, whether you drink the post-workout shake during or after, it probably really doesn't matter.
Okay.
I used to like to drink it during, and, you know, lately I haven't, because my training, you know, with everything going on, it's just a little bit different. So, but for me, it was nice in between sets, you know, to get a little sip, and I would make mine pretty salty. And so I would dilute some orange juice with dextrose and sodium into about a liter of water, and I would drink that through my workout. So, it was great. And anecdotally, I felt great, but was it necessary? No. And I'm not competing, so it's not like it gave me any kind of an advantage for anything.
Right. Maybe if you're depleted and you're having that around your workout, maybe it'll help.
Right. Definitely some either during or after, you know, it doesn't necessarily, you know, and a lot of people in the general population, they're not even going to need to do that, to be honest with you. You know, they're just, you know, they're probably not training hard enough or often enough that it's going to be that necessary. If they're getting a solid meal, you know, within that 2-hour time frame after, they're fine.
I agree 100%. And that's kind of like where my training kind of evolves. So like right now I'm kind of training with low repetitions in reserve or high repetitions in reserve, and my training's not super intense. So I don't actually put that in until like I'm at a large volume and I know there's potentially a need for it, or I feel there might be. Cool. I really appreciate that. So let's go on to the next thing I had here. So this is kind of more of like the premise of this podcast, this question, but I wrote, how does optimal health make us better bodybuilders / help us maximize hypertrophy? And then what is potentially wrong with the standard bodybuilding diet
Yeah, no, that's actually a great question. And it's a really interesting concept, because I mean, you've heard Stan and I talk, and we always say, you know, if you want to be healthy, don't compete. Because at some point, those two things are opposing each other. You know, and that's for any sport. That's not just bodybuilding or physique athletes. You know, that's literally any sport. Once you get to that pinnacle of competition, the things that you're doing are not necessarily quote unquote healthy. Now, how does health play into this? Well, we can try to keep them as healthy as possible, and that's the approach here. So how does that impact bodybuilding? You need to be healthy to be able to perform the things that you need to do for training and everything else. And you need to be able to provide your body the environment to recover from that training. You know, everybody gets really excited about the training, and it's really important, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small, you know, it's just the stimulus. You know, everything is really happening when you leave the gym. But it's, you know, the stuff when you leave the gym is not that immediate gratification. Like, you don't feel exhausted, hopefully, from having like a steak, you know, or a good meal, or, you know, getting enough sleep. You know, you're not going to, that's one that you'll actually feel a little bit different. But I mean, you know, usually if you're just going through the day, getting your meals, you know, you'll feel pretty good, but it's not the same as just going in and just tearing yourself up. You know, you immediately know that you had a great workout. So, making sure that you optimize health is what's going to keep you healthy and allow you to continue to train longer. And so there's the longevity thing, because as you age, like, you know, like me, you start to get, you know, those little aches and pains and things like that. And then you've got to get a little bit more creative with your training and train around it. And, you know, if you suffer an injury, depending on the severity, you know, you're not training at all. And so things just really start to happen if you don't, you know, prioritize taking care of what's going on and giving yourself the recovery period. So I'd say that's the biggest thing, is that you can't do what you want to do in terms of competition if you're not healthy. So, and then what was your second question? I'm sorry.
What's wrong with the standard bodybuilding diet that's still being practiced?
So the quote unquote standard bodybuilding diet that's gained a lot of popularity, you know, and we see it a lot. Unfortunately, I see it a lot in like bikini competitors. That's probably the most extreme, although it happens on the men's side too. But immediately they'll get a coach or a guru and they have them on, chicken breast and broccoli and white fish, and they have them eating less than 1,000 calories. And, it's all that they'll remove egg yolks and give them peanut butter. And it's this, super ultra clean diet. And the issue with that is that the food choices there, while there's no necessarily bad foods, the combinations now that you've provided them are not the nutrient dense foods that are going to give them any chance of getting all of the nutrients that they need to perform at their best, especially considering that their activity level and stress level is probably far above what most people's stress level is. And along with the bodybuilding diet, they're usually told to, wake up, super early in the morning to do some fasted cardio, and then, to do everything they need to do during the day. They end up getting, 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night, and, their coach is super happy because they're grinding, and they're just toughing it out and getting through the thing, and they feel miserable. So it's working, and I just think that's a terrible approach. You don't need to suffer per se to see a lot of advancement. So that's the issue, is you're taking people and you're putting them in a caloric deficit, and then you're taking these food items that are just giving them absolutely no chance to even get close to the levels of nutrients that they need to perform. And so that's what I'd say would be the biggest issue.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest things the vertical diet kind of taught me was that, so I had a coach like that prior, and it's always like, work harder. I'd be like losing weight and he'd be like, all right, 20 more minutes of cardio. I'm like, I lost a pound this week. What do you, and stuff like that, where I'm like, this is kind of ridiculous. But one thing that it has really taught me is that you want your body working for you. So you don't like the suffering when you're really close to a show is gonna happen regardless. But you shouldn't have to be like, I would be laying in bed trying to go pee, and I'd have to like psych myself up. Or like, all right, come on, Dylan, you're going to get up. Like, I just didn't have the energy for it before. And so I'm like, I don't know if this kind of suffering is productive towards my end goal. And I started to realize that, like, I'll suffer in the gym all day. I'll grind myself into the ground if that's what it takes, which I'm learning that maybe it might not be the case always, especially after having Dr. Mike on. But I feel like there are times to work really hard and to suffer, but then there are also times to pull back. And I think that's a really big thing that this has taught me, is because like I feel pretty good, so I'm able to perform better, and I'm able to, when I need to call on that ability to suffer, quote unquote, or go really hard, I have it there, versus I'm just trying to pull energy from nowhere while I'm eating, no fat, and I have barely any sleep, and I already did an hour cardio, and I have to train. I think that's something that it's really taught me is I was kind of instilled in this mindset. I always have to be working harder and suffering. And it's like, well, maybe there are times to be able to do that. And this structure of having those micronutrients in has allowed me to be able to call on that and use it productively.
Yeah. You got to work smarter, not necessarily just harder, And
yeah, exactly.
You bring up a good point, because the periodization thing, we're really good about periodizing our training, most people, or you should be. And if you aren't, you might want to revisit that. But you need to do that with your diet too. And we talk about that a lot. The same way that you would take a deload week for your training, you probably, every 4 to 6 weeks might need to do the same thing with your diet, depending on the person. Some people it may be a little bit longer window, but and that's the other thing, is that people get this misconception that, and the same thing happens with the standard bodybuilding diet. You get these coaches that are making changes on almost a daily basis. And I understand when you get close to the show, like show day, you're going to make some changes that will be visible, right? But I hate peak week. I absolutely hate it. I've always hated it. I always say, if you need to peak, you're probably not ready, because it's usually when people screw it up. And the biggest challenge is getting people out of their own way. If you can just have them be consistent on something and not mess with it very much. And changing a diet, like, daily especially, is way too often. You got to give the body at least, it usually takes about 2 weeks for it to really kind of get into the new rhythm and adjust and respond to the way that you're now feeding it. So that's why I'm pretty open with any of the clients that I take on. Like, look, we're not going to make, I'm not going to give you some new diet next week or tomorrow. Like you're going to do this for a minute and we're going to follow what you're doing. And then we're going to adjust it according to what's going on, and we're going to take some objective measurements to see what's actually happening so that we're addressing the actual things that we need to address. We're not just, blindly throwing darts at the dartboard. So great question. I think that's a great topic. We could do a whole day on that.
Dude, I wrote so many questions for you. I just I have probably, I was like, all right, what's the best I can get out of this? I'm
we'll
thinking of
again.
stuff. So, that'd be awesome. I was driving to work. I'm like, Siri, can you take a note? And I was like talking about, that's and just one more thing on that. I think that's really smart as far as I feel like sometimes coaches, one, feel this obligation to constantly change things because it's going to elicit some magical result. And then also you have expectations from the client who thinks, oh, he's changing stuff every week. Stuff's definitely happening, where it's realistically
he's doing something. Yeah.
Yeah. We're realistically you can write, I've had times where I rode the same diet out for 4 weeks and I'm still getting great results. Why change it? Why
change it if it's working? Yeah.
Yeah. Get more metabolic adaptation, have to eat less, maybe look more flat. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I think making those expectations, especially if it's a coach-client relationship, setting that standard, hey, listen, I have a client right now where he lost a lot of weight, but I'm like, okay, now we need to kind of slow that down because we can't do this linearly for a long time. Let's do a maintenance phase for a couple of weeks, get you back at baseline, and then we'll, we can't go down for a year straight. So
right.
You gotta tell them, because that's what they expect is they want to, continue to make progress, and that's one step back for two forward, if that makes sense.
Yep. Definitely.
Cool. And then, so the next question I had was the importance of micronutrition in a diet for maximizing hypertrophy. And I think you already touched on that, just maybe briefly, more specifically.
In a nutshell. So for those out there, so you fuel your body with your everything you're taking in. Okay. And so you give your body energy through macronutrients. Macronutrients are the only things that are giving your body energy because they are the things that contain calories. Micronutrients don't contain calories, therefore they don't give your body energy. However, what micronutrients do is allow your body to use the energy and nutrients from the macros to actually convert it into usable energy by the body. So they're cofactors and coenzymes. So they're still extremely important because they're basically the lock and key that allows those macros to do what they need to do in the body.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So I guess we'll switch. Do you have anything else on that, Dylan?
I was just going to say, I have one more question here too on that, on kind of that piggybacking off that. But yeah, I was just going to say, I think a lot of bodybuilders tend to have these diets that are just, like you said, chicken, rice, and they don't really think about that. So these coenzymes, all these things help to, I heard you talking about, yeah. Right. And I heard you talk about that, injecting B12 isn't going to create energy, but it helps your body utilize maybe your macronutrient intake better. Is that?
If you got somebody that's B12 deficient, okay, injections may be necessary at some point, but for most people, they can get the B12 they need if they just incorporate the right amount of foods in their diet. You're going to have the exceptions. You're going to have people who are extremely, very plant-based, which is totally fine. They may have to supplement a little bit here and there, but there's not really any evidence out there to suggest that taking, 100,000% of your daily B12 is really going to help you. And there's some evidence to suggest that could be detrimental, so these, massive doses of things like that, and the shots. The other thing that people don't realize is that, B12, the shot is a pre-activated form. Okay. And so B12 gets activated in the stomach with intrinsic factors. So part of the process is actually eating it and letting it go through the body. Because I've seen some products out there. There was a product, it was like an inhalant B12. And I'm like, why? It's not passing through your stomach. It's not getting activated. I don't believe it was a pre-activated form. So yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding around it because a lot of terms just end up getting used misappropriately in marketing. And so it catches on and then it just, gains traction. And so there it goes. So, I'm not saying that supplements or vitamin injections like that are never needed, but for most people, they can probably get what they need from food.
So you're saying my ultra micronized alkalinized creatine doesn't work?
It might, but you're probably already saturated with the amount of red meat that you're eating. So.
All right, good to know. Importance of obtaining micronutrition from foods versus a multivitamin. That kind of just piggybacks on that.
That is a great question. So when it comes down to nutrients or anything, right? Everything is a chemical. So in order for it to be, let's say B12, it's going to be the exact same chemical compound, whether you took it in a supplement or food. The interesting thing, and there's a lot of data to support this, is that our bodies seem to assimilate the nutrients from food a little bit better because you've got the combination of the other nutrients that are in the foods and the trace nutrients. The meat factor in the literature. That doesn't mean that you can't absorb well from supplements. I would say the drawback with supplements compared to food is that with the supplements, you're only getting what they decided to put in that bottle. Whereas if you're eating a steak or something of that nature, you're going to get all the other stuff in there. So if you take a B12 supplement, you're only getting that B12. If you eat a steak, you're getting the B12, you're getting the iron, you're getting choline, you're getting the zinc, you're getting all that stuff that's in there that you aren't getting from that B12. So, I'm not necessarily against supplements. I think there's a time and a place. But I think a lot of people turn to that first rather than correcting their nutrition and then using supplement as a supplement. You know what I mean? So I think if a lot of people would just pay attention and take a little bit more time to prioritize the food choices that they're making, they'd probably realize that they're probably wasting a lot of money on that supplements, and that could go more towards quality food that they may even be able to assimilate a little bit better.
Right. And I think something that I pay attention to, as you said, maybe a small difference. And I would like to say that for myself, I'm chasing optimality, and I'm chasing that small difference because the more muscle I acquire, the harder it is to put on muscle. And I look for these small differences so I'm looking at, I understand for maybe Gen Pop, maybe sometimes that might not be their first priority. But I also focus on the idea that sometimes these small differences are actually monumental when putting on an extra pound or two of muscle mass. But I like what you said there too, is that people will buy a multivitamin and buy creatine powder before they even look at their diet. And a lot of the time, or honestly, sometimes people will look at taking enhancements before they even fix their diet, which is like just crazy to me. But it's like, one, you could be saving a ton of money. Two, you may not even need some of those things. You haven't observed a need for them in the first place. You just gotta just throw the kitchen sink at it with my buddy works at a supplement shop, and he'll come in and be like, yeah, dude, this guy spent, and he's kind of like me, like, yeah, he spent $800 on products. And I'm like, $800? Like, what do you even, do with all that? So, I think it's pretty crazy, but I like that point you made there.
I had a quick question on that. I wanted to ask, what do you think that in the standard diet, there's any vitamins that are probably lacking? Maybe you don't get the full amount.
Well, if we're talking about the standard American diet,
yeah, let's say 2000. Yeah, maybe somewhat.
There's a lot of talk out there about like depletion of nutrients in soil and how that affects our food supply. Right now, there's not enough evidence to suggest that we can't get more than enough nutrients from food, even with all those things happening, right? And even I will say, I worked in the agriculture sector for a minute, with industry, and there's a lot going on in terms of regenerative agriculture. And, I give farmers and ranchers all the credit in the world. I mean, those people just science the hell out of everything, and everything they do is data driven. And they are some of the most efficient people on this planet when it comes to producing, a safe and nutrient food supply. I can't say enough about them. From all areas. People don't understand what goes into that. And these guys are rock stars in my mind. So in terms of like, just in general, I think people more so run into deficiencies because of the way that they're building their diet, or what they're just allowing themselves to get away with in terms of their eating. People are habitual. They'll get in these regimens, which is totally fine. But if you're just allowing yourself to treat yourself poorly, like Dylan said earlier, you're going to have some issues. And especially in the competitive physique world, if you're already eating a deficit, and this, I go back to the bikini thing example, because they usually eat so few calories. Like, good luck trying to get the nutrients you need at that calorie intake anyway, So you need to be just on top of the food choices that you're making to get the most nutrients out of those, because you need the biggest return on investment. If you've got somebody like Thor or one of those guys who's eating 10,000 plus calories a day, yeah, he's still got a huge nutrient need, but getting him the nutrients is going to be an easier task in terms of, because they're taking in so much food, we can probably add that stuff in there, versus it's, the bikini competitor who's eating 1,800 calories, and training, once or twice a day, man, that's a big ask,
Yeah. That's the macros argument. I mean, like someone like Thor could probably have a Snickers bar, but you have a bikini competitor eat a Snickers bar, and there goes half of her calories for the day. Yeah. I mean, not that I would say those are optimal in the first place, but I think people who are in that crowd sometimes are like, oh, well, I'm gonna have a Snickers bar, and it's like you could have had a potato, you could have got some potassium, and you could have had a steak, which your B12, your iron, all that stuff. So that's especially when you're that low in calories.
I would say that's probably, Dylan's point right there. Potassium is probably the most, one of the most overlooked nutrients. I always tell people, even the people that I work with, not very many people track their meals to begin with, but the people that are good about it initially and come in, I'm like, cool. Well, do you track your calories? They're like, yeah. And I track my macros, and they're like, yeah, I track my sodium. I'm like, well, have you ever tracked potassium? And they're like, no. And I'm like, do that for a day, see where you end up. And usually they're less than half of what they would probably do.
Yeah.
And I'm like, try to get this much potassium, and the foods that you have to eat to do that, it really just takes you down that funnel of the foods that you should probably be eating anyway.
Yeah. Now your menu is a little bit more narrowed down because of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so then we'll get to the next question for protein sources. I hear this a lot. A lot of people are kind of talking about protein sources. Meat, red meat versus a chicken versus a turkey. Is red meat bad for us?
So that's another great question, because the whole concept is X food bad? The answer is always going to be it depends. Because, and my short answer for red meat is no, it's not bad. But just to give an example, I always use water. Okay, so is water bad for you? Everybody's gonna be like, oh no. Well, it depends, because if you drink too much right now, it sure as hell is, because you'll die, Right. So everything is dose dependent, and it's nutrition across the board is very conceptual. So it's very based on, what is going on in that moment. It's based on, where you're at, like what time of day is it? What have you had to eat so far? What do you have left for the day? What are you going to be doing? What activity are you fueling? How does this affect your digestion? Are you allergic to this? Do you have any, do you like this food? If you hate this food and you hate the way it tastes, you're not going to eat it every day. So then that throws it out the window too. So for red meat, I say it's a delicious multivitamin. It's honestly one of the most nutrient dense things you can eat.
Yeah.
And that's why we've made it the forefront of the vertical diet. And we're big on whole eggs too, because eggs are essentially the gold standard in terms of protein for digestion absorption.
Right.
But red meat in particular, it's so easy to pick on red meat with all the activist groups out there and all the things they say about it. And all of that is extremely inaccurate. I mean, I've seen the entire life cycle of beef, yes, we sacrifice an animal at the end of it to consume it, and it's a shame that we're taking a life, but we need to make sure we maximize it. And so that's why they try to get nose to tail and make sure that they use every single portion of it they can for very useful things. The thing about the ruminant animals in terms of beef and bison is with their stomach profile, because they're ruminants, they're able to what we call upcycle protein. So they can eat things that we can't as humans, because they're able to break down cellulose and we can't. So cellulose is the plant cell wall. So you can literally feed a cow a whole corn stalk. If we were eating an ear of corn, we eat the corn and we got that whole stalk left over. They can eat that whole damn thing, and they'll be able to turn that into tissue that we can consume that is now extremely nutrient dense and good for us. So, that's one of the reasons we domesticated them in the first place. Now, the argument against it in terms of the animal cruelty thing, they do everything in their power to reduce that as much as possible. Like anything else, there's bad people in every sector, but in terms of ranchers as a whole, that is not something that's a common practice. And anything that happens, they really have very little tolerance for it, and they address it. Same thing in dairy. For the people that are just, they don't want to consume an animal, that's totally fine. People can still probably do fine on a plant-based diet. And we have people who are vegan and vegetarian that follow vertical protocols. We use different proteins with them. But for those people who are, I'll eat whatever you tell me to eat, as long as it is the best thing that I can take in terms of nutrient profile, digestion, absorption, and optimizing health. I would say that red meat is one of the best things that you can take in. And then we recommend, 2 servings of salmon a week, just for the EPA and DHA. That seems to be more than enough for folks. If they want to do it more often, that's fine too. But we really build the diet around beef and eggs. So, well, red meat and eggs, I should say.
Right. Can you name some of the benefits that some like bison or like a red meat has over something like a chicken protein? I know chicken doesn't really contain creatine or anything like that, but.
Right. So that's one of them. So red meat's going to have a lot more creatine. It's going to have a lot more zinc. It's going to have a lot more B12. It's basically got, 9 essential amino acids or 9 essential nutrients that we don't produce on our own that you can get from the beef. Also got a little dietary cholesterol, which is actually a good thing.
Right.
The fat that you find in lean red meats, whether it be bison or beef, is the majority is from monounsaturated fats, which is the quote unquote healthy fats, which is a big misconception. We've come a long way in terms of producing red meat, and that's why I said it comes back to the science. They have PhD animal nutritionists come up with the feed to give these animals based on their genetic profile to optimize the end product. I mean, it's insane. The same steak today from where it was, 30 years ago is about 30% leaner. I mean, that's amazing. It's all based on, genetic breeding and feed. We've realized what certain things we can do to really optimize that. And it's amazing. So you're just to get that kind of stuff from chicken or white fish. It just doesn't have the same nutrient profile. It doesn't have as many in there. You can get really quality protein, like chicken, all that stuff. Great for getting protein, but you're just not going to get those other trace nutrients because they're a monogastric animal and their lifespan is a little bit different, and it's just not the same production of an end product.
Now, just out of curiosity, does chicken contain the same amino acid profile as like a meat? Does it have the complete amino acid spectrum with the 9?
It's a complete protein. The actual individual amino acids are going to vary a little bit, but it is a complete protein. So the way to approach that is that any animal source is a complete protein. With plant-based, soy, depending on how it's made, okay, because once it goes through the processing, depending on the product, it can strip some of that out of there. Quinoa is a complete protein, but that pretty much covers the list. I mean, most everything else you're going to have to pair. Most plant proteins are incomplete. The other thing for me with the plant proteins, and again, if people want to be plant-based, as long as they're diligent about it, they can get what they need.
Right.
A big drawback for me is that most plant proteins, because of that cellulose, the digestion, absorption, and the bioavailability of the nutrients is so much lower than it is from an animal source. That's why, if it's somebody that's like, listen, I don't care if I'll eat animal products, I'm always going to promote those first because of the digestibility and absorption.
Gotcha.
It's interesting because I see a lot of people use that. I think it's biological protein scale.
Yeah.
I think where it's like we have like whey and all these other things above, but that list doesn't account for actual micronutrition at all.
Right.
And I think it does account for bioavailability. I can't remember.
That's what it's supposedly scoring. And there's still, there's some holes in what we have now.
I see a lot of people reference that, and I'm like, well, a whey protein is probably good, but maybe its impact on performance is different than steak, and the steak is below that on that list, right?
The scale, every scale we have, whether you're talking about the PDSAA, I think it is now, and I probably said that wrong, but it's the protein digestibility an availability score, I think is what it is. That's probably the best that we have right now in terms of that, but it's still not perfect. Neither is the glycemic index, neither is the satiety index. Like nothing that we have is perfect, and there's drawbacks, but what that bioavailability scale is essentially measuring, you're right, is they'll, radioactively isolate an amino acid to see how well it was absorbed. And so based on that, that's what they're looking at. And it's good, but it doesn't tell the whole story like you were talking about, Dylan. It's not, taking into account the other minerals and nutrients that are in that food and the big picture. It's just looking at the protein digestion and absorption rate. So
yeah, that's just a flaw that I think I personally observed from that, because I was looking at it and I'm like, everybody always says, like, I think egg whites is like way up on that list too.
Eggs are considered the gold standard.
Yeah. Well, eggs are great.
Actually it's the whole egg, because there's actually there's a higher concentration of protein in a yolk. There's just more volume of egg white. So
yeah,
but there's a higher concentration of protein in the yolk. So
I just want to pull it up real quick. Matt, you had a question on eggs, huh?
Yeah, actually I did, because it's funny, actually. I went shopping yesterday. My buddy, he was actually into the gym too. He's grabbing these egg whites, and I told him not to. I wanted you to,
Did you smack him out of his hand?
Yeah, he's like, oh, pick up the egg whites. I'm like, no. So could we go into some of the nutritional value of the egg and then the egg yolk itself, with it being the cholesterol?
Yeah, so eggs are just, they're amazing in terms of nutrients. It's like we said, it's the gold standard for protein. The egg yolk in particular, it's got the dietary cholesterol, which we now know is, probably nothing to really be scared of, especially from eggs. There's been a lot of research on egg consumption, and they've fed people a lot of whole eggs a day, and it doesn't affect their dietary or their blood cholesterol levels. We know that it can help with strength independent of hypertrophy. But the other thing is it's also got choline, which is really, essential for liver health. You can overdo it on choline, so there is kind of a sweet spot for all these nutrients. But, a big part of that, if people are just, having what we would recommend for egg consumption on a regular basis, they're going to, get a lot of the choline from that. There's biotin in there, which is, really good for hair, skin, and nails and energy production. So it's just an overall really great thing. There are people that do have an allergy. So for those people, obviously they're going to avoid it. I definitely would not recommend eating eggs raw. There's this, concept that when you're cooking it, it's denaturing the protein. And yeah, that happens. That's why coagulation exists. But you're talking about a marginal difference. And the risk of, getting salmonella from the raw egg is so high that, if you get that, now you're not training. So what advantage did you have? So I would highly caution against the raw egg consumption.
Are you saying that Rocky Balboa was wrong?
Yes.
That's where I drive all of my nutrition information, is that movie.
Yeah. That's a solid data point right there.
Yeah. I'm lifting logs upstairs and drinking raw eggs.
I hear also with the raw eggs, the absorption of the protein is kind of lower than it is if they were cooked. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, and you've got the avidin in there that'll reduce the absorption of other nutrients. So it's just problematic. I mean, It's all around. It's pretty problematic. I don't know necessarily if the raw eggs are going to reduce the protein absorption, but the avidin will definitely reduce the absorption of other things. So
yeah.
Here, I wanted to screen share that. What were you saying, Matt?
No, go ahead and bring up your screen, and then I'll
I just wanted to show the food scale. So this is what it kind of just, I don't know, was interesting to me when I was looking at it. I think I was doing a video. So you do have whole eggs up here, but you have a whey protein isolate up here. As far as, I don't know, what is it? Biological value measurement, determined percentage of the given nutrient source utilized by the body. So you have a lean beef way down here. But like I said, I think it's just only measuring one value. And it's like, well, there's a lot of nutrition in here versus an egg white, which is up here. Right. And so I'm thinking like, this is a very narrow way of looking at it, because I feel like, yeah, you could meet your macronutrient requirements, but I just think like even a cow's milk is just, it's kind of low for something like that on that specific scale.
You can pull up 10 scales and these scores are going to be a little bit different on each one of those.
Yeah.
I've seen other scales where the lean beef is a 92. So, it really just depends on who's doing the test and what they at. And, it's going to vary a little bit, but it's still such a high quality item.
Right. I just think a lot of people reference
is excellent that people shouldn't just be worried about the protein.
Right. Yeah, I just have seen people reference that, especially like selling products and things like that. Oh, well, look, whey protein's here at the top, and I'm like, yeah, but it doesn't have a lot of those good.
That's 80% of milk.
Yeah.
Quick question I wanted to throw in with the eggs too. The egg yolk itself, with it being cholesterol kind of heavy, does it impact hormones? Does it kind of regulate hormone? I know the cholesterol in eggs kind of act as a sterile, I want to say, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. So cholesterol is the precursor to testosterone and all the other stored hormones. So your estrogen and anything like that. So can it affect your hormone level? Absolutely. You'll get the people that'll freak out like, oh my God, like if I'm a woman, I shouldn't be doing it. Well, no, it's going to help you optimize and balance your hormone levels because they're all based on a feedback loop and those are more reactive than anything. So helping you get that cholesterol in there is really going to help. So,
yeah.
Sorry, we'll try to move through these last couple and try to get you out of here. I had, these are a couple of actual, my personal experiences with blood work. But I'm just curious, the blood, and I've also seen people quote like just their lipid panel as really, they put a lot of weight in it as far as their cardiovascular health. And I feel like there's a bigger picture going on. And I feel like I've read that even in the vertical diet. So I'm just kind of curious, what is the effect of blood lipids? And then I also myself, and I don't want to use this as medical advice, but I use exogenous hormones. And I've always had problems with my HDL from that. Is there an intervention that may be good for myself?
So let's just get the last question first. A lot of the exogenous compounds will suppress HDL, and you can do the things that we're going to talk about for Gen Pop who are not enhanced to try to increase it, but the compounds are probably going to be too powerful. They're probably just going to continue. Yeah. There's probably not a lot you're going to overcome if you're taking those exogenous compounds.
Right. Yeah, I kind of become a hypochondriac, but then it's like you said, it's like optimal health isn't competing. And so sometimes I'm like, I just want a perfect panel. And it's like, you're going to have to sacrifice some things, I think. And yeah, I got to realize that sometimes.
So for lipid panel, I mean, there's a lot of criteria and there's just a lot of components to a total lipid panel, right? You've got your HDLs, your high density lipoproteins, your LDLs, your low density lipoproteins. You've got your VLDLs, your very low density lipoproteins. You've got your triglycerides. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this. And so it's a really complex thing. And to say that somebody is just cardiovascularly at high risk just based on an LDL score just doesn't tell the whole story. Could they be at high risk? Absolutely. Using that one data point is probably not appropriate. And I think that most people in the medical community would absolutely agree with me on this. I mean, you got to look at everything else. And this is where metabolic syndrome is a really good example to use, because you can have somebody who's borderline high on several factors, such as hypertension. They could have, where they're just a little bit high on that. They could be just a little bit low on their HDLs, and they could be just a little bit high on their triglycerides. And they could be at a higher risk for a cardiovascular event than somebody that is only high in their LDLs. So trying to quantify that risk is a huge challenge. And I don't think we're at that point with our technology to be able to do it very well, as a medical community. And so I think looking at the whole picture, your body weight, and especially your waist circumference, that seems to be a huge teller of your overall risk for a lot of things is your waist circumference. And a lot of the other, what's your blood pressure at? What are your triglycerides at? Like all of these other things. And then what's your platelet count? Like what's your ferritin level? What's your red blood cell count? Like there's all these other things that are going to go into establishing a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, that it can't just be, oh, I've got high HDLs or high LDLs. I'm it's super high risk. Well, what's the rest of your blood panel look like? So,
Right.
so it's a comprehensive thing. Now, what can people do to increase their HDLs? Number one thing for general population is achieve an appropriate body weight. Okay. If you and reduce your waist circumference. If your waist circumference is high and you're carrying a lot of central adiposity, get rid of that shit. Okay. That's working against you. And that will be a huge thing on getting you to that point. And how do you do that? Well, you're going to be active. And so physical activity is another component of this, and especially resistance training will help to increase those HDLs. The other thing is that taking in the appropriate nutrients. So, getting the appropriate amount of, especially the monounsaturated fats, seems to be something that can help. And so, again, that's the primary source of fat from red meat. So if you're using lean red meats, that's another reason why we include it in the diet, is that it's going to also help with that. And then the other nutrients in there, the zinc and the magnesium, those are also going to help with these things. And then keeping your thyroid healthy. A lot of people don't realize there's that can play a role in all this too. So making sure that your thyroid's optimized. All of those things. Now, just people are like, oh, I need to raise my HDLs, and they think it's like this really easy thing to do. And it's not. It's a challenge. And you'll get people that'll talk about, supplementing niacin or things like that. There is some data to show that might be helpful, but there's also data to show that there may be non-responders. So I wouldn't go to a supplement first. I would do those other things, that are challenging. Get to appropriate body weight, eat right, and start training. Those are going to be the most important things.
Right. I would say anecdotally, the biggest impact was getting my body fat percentage down, because I'm a bodybuilder, so body weight is somewhat high, and that's kind of sometimes not negotiable. I mean, I will drop it occasionally, but like having the actual amount of muscle mass, having my body weight high is unfortunately just where it has to be at the time. But I would say getting the body fat actually down has improved my HDL. And I'm experimenting with a couple other things, and I want to see if maybe they have some effect, because I have done literally all those other things that you said. And like I said, and like you said, it's never going to be perfect. But I still want to get them and improve them over time. And so I'm kind of monitoring the blood work and whatnot. But yeah.
And HDLs, it seems to be a little bit tougher because women need to get them a little bit higher, and it seems to be a more uphill battle for them. And you're absolutely right. It's not just body weight, it's more body composition. And that comes back to the central adiposity for most people. Like if you're carrying some weight in your midsection, your body composition is not optimal. So trying to get that to a good point. And that doesn't mean you need to be like, sub 8% body fat, but get it down to a, healthy level, low teens, for men. And probably, low to mid 20s for women is appropriate. So,
also, so I was going to ask, I have a lot of people that I help out. Maybe if I'm not even coaching them, I just kind of give them some advice. And one of the things I always tell them is to try to avoid vegetable oils when they can. What is the like effects on health for things like PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, vegetable oils, processed vegetable oils, and maybe it might be a good idea. Why isn't it maybe a good idea to avoid them if you can?
So based on the literature, there's not a lot of data to suggest that they are as harmful as a lot of people suggest. With that being said, I don't know if we've done a good job as a scientific community of evaluating them completely yet. I don't know if we have the whole story. For a lot of people, they may just be consuming too much of them, and they may be consuming too much omega-6, and that could be throwing off their body's balance of omega-6 to omega-3. And when that happens, those people can't necessarily just supplement omega-3 to balance that back out. They actually have to reduce their omega-6 intake. And, from a health perspective, I mean, there's some pretty solid data to show that you can still consume them, and it may not be an issue for health. They could be more inflammatory than some of the other things that we recommend in the diet. So I know this is a super soft answer for you.
No, I understand.
But from a science, I know Stan goes hard on the processed vegetable oils, and for me, it's based on the science. I can't be like, oh my gosh, the literature totally shows, because it doesn't. I mean,
right.
the data doesn't show that you should just completely avoid it, but we think it's probably a better approach not to include it.
Right.
You know,
we're using the evidence that we currently have to maybe say, oh, this might not be the best idea.
Right.
But I think in a typical Western diet, you don't get a good omega-6 to 3 ratio. You get a lot of omega-6 consumption. So that's why I made to say, like, err on the side of caution, try to avoid them if you can, and try to get in more wild fish if you can as well. And to kind of maybe fix that ratio a little bit. That's where because you don't want to go around fear mongering and inherently most foods aren't inherently bad for you per se, and maybe dose dependent and things like that. So
yeah, I'm not a big fan of processed vegetable oils. I understand the use of them because they're, in terms of food supply, they're extremely efficient and cheap, and they're in everything, and that's part of the reason why. I don't know if that's caused, a lot of the major health problems of our society, or like some people try to say, but
correlation.
Here on the side of caution, like you said, it's probably something that if you can reduce that intake and focus your attention somewhere else, it might be more optimal. Do I have any data to show that? Probably not. That's our anecdotal approach.
Hey, you know what? I'd rather cook my food in some butter than some canola oil. So
same here.
Well, I think I just want to throw one thing in there with I've had people recommend to me that my iron's also high, hematocrit, normal stuff that someone who uses exogenous hormones would be, and I'd like to get them better, but someone recommended to lower my red meat consumption, and I'm a little cautious of doing that. Are there other things I could potentially do to get that down? I know donating might help that, but
yeah. So donating blood. So this is where a lot of people don't necessarily evaluate all of the things in their blood that they should before they go donate. And especially, with women, they menstruate, so they kind of have a built-in, thing that takes care of this for them. For men, the only way we can do this is to go donate. And when you go donate, they test your red blood cell count, and that's essentially what they're basing everything on. And for those people who are using exogenous compounds, their red blood cell count is usually at the top, or sometimes too high to even donate. That doesn't tell the story. Because you can have a high red blood cell count, but your ferritin and your iron could actually be pretty low. So if you donate at that point, you're going to feel like you got hit by a truck, and you're going to be
right.
So going to getting a panel, like an iron panel, would probably be the best thing to really evaluate that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of physicians that will talk about that, but in terms of reducing iron, I mean, I worked with people that the preparation of your food can matter. If you're cooking all your steaks in a cast iron skillet, that can shoot your iron up pretty high because the iron get in there. Reducing red meat consumption, it only if it's necessary, right? I mean, you'd have to look at the whole panel. Do you really need to reduce your red blood or your red meat consumption because your whole panel is showing that, or is it just red blood cell count because of the compounds and some of the red meat here and there? And is that an issue? I guess that's where, you kind of got to step back and take a full evaluation of, well, am I really at a point where it is truly a problem?
I've exhausted the other, maybe potential
places. Yeah. And if you're going to donate. I mean, that's, the blood banks always need, good blood. So that's an option. Otherwise, just evaluating the situation and really taking a look at, is this something that is truly an issue?
Right. I guess so. I got deferred because my iron's high, so I'm taking IP6 to maybe if I can get accepted. I've done that before, but GGT and ferritin are in range. But a long time ago, Stan sent me a video where the couple gentlemen were talking about maybe the ranges are a little too high in the United States for GGT and ferritin. So I was a little concerned about that personally, having all of those markers high. So I was thinking donating, maybe taking IP6, and then I think my last exhaustible resource would just take out a red meat meal and switch it for a fish every day. But that's what I'm thinking my approach is for that.
Yeah, I mean, you could try to have your red meat with some calcium sources, because that'll block some of the iron uptake. Okay. So if you're having red meat, have some yogurt or milk with it.
Could I maybe take my daily yogurt meal and split it? Would that help with the frequency? Maybe having a little bit of the yogurt with every meal.
Yeah, any calcium in the bloodstream with the red meat will reduce the calcium or the iron absorption. So
Should probably take my caffeine intake down a little bit too then.
yeah, and so the caffeine will actually inhibit the calcium uptake. So
Yeah.
caffeine within 2 hours before or after your calcium, you're not going to take that in. So it gets pretty tricky when you get.
I know. I'm trying to balance out all these little variables and whatnot.
Yeah, so that would be something you could try, is just, including some calcium with the red meat meals. Will it help? Maybe not, and maybe the donating will help, maybe not. So
yeah,
it's one of those things.
No, yeah, I appreciate I know you can't really give me hard answers, but all right, cool. 2 more questions and we'll get you out of here. Sorry it's taken so long.
No problem.
Matt, you go.
Oh, okay. So the first question was in regards to sleep. How important is sleep, and what's the optimal time to kind of get your good rest in, get some growth hormone activated?
So for the people that aren't familiar with Stan and I, we talk about sleep more than food. So that's how important it is.
My CPAP hanging on the wall there.
Yeah, it's so people don't even realize that they're getting a terrible night's sleep a lot of the times, and so literature, they've actually been able to do a really good job of kind of quantifying the impact. And I think it was back in 2012, it was Untitled Chapter and his team. They brought in some people, and they did a sleep study where they were able to house these people, and they had a metabolic chamber. So they were able to control for calories in and their energy expenditure, and they equated everything. And they had them sleep for 8.5 hours and 5.5 hours, and started to compare the two. And they took all these different parameters, and they showed that when they got 5.5 hours versus 8.5 hours, their lipolysis went down by like 55%. So their fat burn went down by 55%, and their muscle wasting went up by about 60. And so this kind of thing, a lot of it, there's a lot of different mechanisms for this, but my background in IGF-1, part of the reason that's happening is because there's a complete shift in your IGF-1 axis. You've got all these binding proteins, and those dictate behavior. So they've done studies in the military looking at, soldiers downrange. They're under a high stress level. They're not sleeping very well. They're not eating very well, and they've got a high physical demand. So that sounds a lot like bodybuilders, right? Student athletes, or a lot of other people in society that have a stressful job, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Within 6 to 8 hours, this IGF-1 axis had completely shifted. And so it started promoting muscle wasting. And part of the reason it happens, IGF-1 is a peptide hormone, so it's a very short half-life. It's, basically converted from growth hormone in the liver. But that's what's going on there, is the body, we're programmed to survive. And so the body, that's what it's doing, is that's its response to kind of survive these things. So if it's getting very low sleep, it will start to promote muscle wasting. It'll start to hang on to fat. It will affect your blood pressure. I mean, your anxiety levels will be off the charts. I mean, sleep is associated with every, adverse health outcome, or poor sleep, I should say, is associated with pretty much every adverse health outcome. It can throw off your hormone balance, and that throws off a lot of other things too. I mean, it is so important. So what we recommend is, and this is based on the body of literature, 7 to 9 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and try to get to sleep before midnight. Now you've got, the first responders and firefighters and things like that. And nurses, and there's people that work graveyards. I live in Vegas. I mean, it's a thing. So for those people, they're not going to get to bed before midnight. So getting to bed at a time and trying to give themselves that 7 to 9 hours of sleep is just going to be important. So then for anybody, they can use blackout blinds. They can use, noise canceling headphones if possible, or earplugs. Just get rid of any kind of distractions, whether that be, animals, pets, things like that, jumping on the bed. For a lot of people, they have sleep apnea. A lot of the people we work with, because they're larger people, when you lay down, all this mass comes up on your throat. They don't even know it, but they're waking up. At this NFL camp, we had one of the guys share with us, he was in bed for 9 hours. He thought he was sleeping for 9 hours. He went and had a sleep study. He was actually asleep for less than 2, because he was waking up and
going to sleep.
It was over a minute. So that's common. I mean, that is common, which just blows my mind. So how do you tell if this is going on if you don't want a sleep study? Well, record yourself, set your phone up and record yourself and see how much you're moving. See, when you're waking up, usually you can kind of tell, and, there'll be some sounds. If you have a significant other, for our top athletes, if they're coming into competition, we have that uncomfortable discussion with their spouse that, they need to go sleep in this other room by themselves,
What's really going on? Yeah.
So that's where people, and again, it comes back to prioritizing it. People need to prioritize it. For anybody that's got sleep apnea, if they're snoring and they're waking up tired, CPAP is probably the way to go. Like they're probably just going to have to go get one. You can get a Dream Station at Walmart. You can get different kind of nose cannulas or face masks, whatever. And they're uncomfortable to begin with, and getting used to it, so it takes a minute. But the outcomes are just it's life changing. So
right. I've anecdotally observed that too. I'll be like in prep and I'll wake up at 5 hours, weigh myself, and I'll go back to bed for another 3 or 4. My weight's all time low if I get that extra sleep in. So that's just an anecdotal observation for myself, even.
So real quick question, do naps kind of play a picture in there? Let's say you need a nap. I'm sure since you're not sleeping long enough, it doesn't really shift anything like that. I mean, you could go into that.
So naps can be beneficial, but they need to be less than a half hour.
Gotcha.
Because if you're sleeping longer than that, you're getting deep enough into that sleep cycle that wake up, you'll actually probably be more drowsy, and it's off than when you did it. So if you're going to take a nap, the power nap is the way to go. Like in probably 20 minutes or less is ideal. But that comes back to, why do you need the nap, right? Are you need the nap because you slept like shit last night? Like what's the real source of this problem? Are you need a nap because you got sleep apnea? Do you need a nap? Whatever it is, right? Can they be beneficial? Sure. But I would, really step back for folks and really have that, self-evaluation of why is this going on?
Mm-hmm. So let's say it was from like kind of a bad night of sleep. Would you recommend a nap, or would you say just kind of wait it out until your next sleep cycle and just kind of?
As long as the nap isn't going to interfere with tonight's sleep.
Gotcha.
That's the thing, right? Is don't do anything today. You can't change last night, but today you can, set yourself up for success tonight. What people don't realize also in terms of nutrition, and this is, they don't think about it. Simple carbohydrates, taking in some simple carbohydrates like white rice or some other simple carbohydrate source within 4 hours of when you're going to go to bed can reduce your sleep onset latency. And sleep onset latency is how fast you're falling asleep. So if you can reduce that, that means you're falling asleep faster. So simple carbohydrates can actually promote you falling asleep faster within 4 hours of going to bed. So you can kind of time your carbohydrates, a little bit during the day for that too.
Damon, I was told to not eat after 6 o'clock. What are you telling me? This is blasphemy.
The internet knows, man.
Oh no. Cool. Well, we'll get you out of here, Damon. I really appreciate your time, man. This is a great conversation. I love talking.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me on. We'll do this again for sure. Definitely.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. So is there anything you wanted to maybe plug or promote?
Sure.
Please.
So if anybody wants, they can follow me on Instagram. It's at Dr. Damon McCune. My website's alliedperformancellc.com. So if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out. And I just appreciate your time,
Yeah, most definitely. I'll have all the links for downloads in the description as well. I'll have Damon's links down below. Are you going to be at the seminar in SAC maybe, or in this area?
I was going to try, but we'll kind of see how things play out at this point.
Okay. Cool.
Some unforeseen changes, right?
Yeah. The detour to some other part of the United States.
Right now, I'm planning on it. I'm going to try, but we'll see.
Cool. Hopefully I'll see you there. I'll be at that one. If anybody's watching and you want to go to SAC, I'll write up with some people too. Matt, you're probably going to be in lab, so I'm not going to ask you.
Yeah, probably.
But if you can, man, you should road trip out here.
Every time, maybe I'll cut some time off and I'll work myself.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, and that one's going to be at Mark Bell's Super Training Gym. In front of me. But for anybody that wants to register for any of these seminars, you can just go to standefforting.com. They're free to attend. And so he's over on the East Coast still right now, making his way back. So
yeah, definitely. You can follow his journey on I'll put his Instagram in there too. But it's really cool. I think the one I went to a couple of years back is just a great opportunity to talk to people, because a lot of people have some of these, if you're experiencing some of those issues from the traditional dieting style, it's really cool to see all these people come together, and then some of them have already tried it. Some of them are looking for something to maybe, help. And it's really cool to be around a lot of like-minded people who maybe experience some of the same problems as you and whatnot. So Yeah.
Well, it's great to meet all the people that show up too, because I learn from the audience. You know, it's great.
Most definitely.
For us too, because I mean, there's, you know, every situation is going to be a little bit different, and it's always,
Right.
you know, as a practitioner, it challenges us to learn more and stay on our toes. So
Most definitely, you can always learn something from everybody, I believe, and
absolutely
talking with people. So cool, man.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, keep in touch, and hopefully we'll do this again. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you guys.
A good time.
Cool.
Yep.
Talk to you soon, man.
Yep. Later.
Bye. Thank you all for watching. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, like the video, and check out the description for links to all of my other services such as coaching and apparel. Thanks.